Welcome to the Deep Dive, brought to you by Safety One Source. Today we're strapping on our hard hats and diving into the OSHA Field Operations Manual.
Ooh, sounds intense.
It is, but think of this as the ultimate playbook for safety and risk management professionals.
Yeah, it's not just about dry regulations. This manual, it really gives you a glimpse behind the curtain.
Behind the curtain of OSHA.
Exactly. Showing you how OSHA inspectors think, what they look for, and how they even build a case if they find violations.
Okay, so it's like having a secret decoder ring.
Yeah.
To understand what makes OSHA tick.
Pretty much.
But why should safety pros like our listeners care so much about this manual?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just about avoiding fines, right?
No. You hit the nail on the head. This manual is all about proactive risk management. It's about anticipating those issues, building a rock-solid safety program, and being prepared if an inspection ever happens.
So if you understand how OSHA operates,
yeah,
you can practically predict their moves.
Yes.
Like some kind of safety chess grandmaster.
Precisely. And one of the biggest takeaways from this manual is the emphasis on documentation.
Right.
Detailed documentation.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just know there's a hazard. You need proof.
Proof, okay.
Think, employee interviews, photos, measurements, the whole 9 yards.
It's like building a legal case.
Exactly.
But for safety, you need the evidence to back it up.
You got it. And get this. The manual even lays out potential defenses that employers might use, like unpreventable employee misconduct.
Whoa, hold on. Unpreventable employee misconduct. That sounds like a tough one to prove.
It can be. And that's why knowing these defenses and how to counter them is so crucial for safety professionals like you.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's say we're dealing with a classic example. Right. An unguarded table saw the manual actually walks you through the exact questions that an inspector might ask, right?
You bet. Things like who removed the guard, why, how long was it unguarded, was there a work rule in place?
Oh, wow.
It's like a checklist.
It is a checklist.
To make sure you've covered all your bases.
So in a way, the manual's like a training tool for us.
Yeah.
We can use it to anticipate those tough questions and make sure we have the right answers, and of course backed up with solid documentation.
Precisely. And it's not just about safety violations. The manual also addresses sensitive areas like trade secrets.
Trade secrets. No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So if a company claims something is a trade secret, does OSHA just have to take their word for it?
Not at all. The manual has specific procedures that inspectors must follow to protect that information. It's a win-win, ensuring compliance without compromising sensitive business data.
So it's like a delicate dance.
Yeah.
Balancing the need for a thorough inspection with the need to protect confidential information.
Exactly. And that reminds me of another critical point. The manual stresses when documenting a potential violation, the level of detail required is incredible.
Okay, give us the inside scoop. What kind of details are we talking about? Paint us a picture.
Well, let's go back to that unguarded table saw. It's not enough to just say unguarded saw bad. You need specifics. We're talking about identifying the exact equipment, maybe even the model and serial number.
Wow.
Pinpoint the location of the hazard, who was exposed, and for how long.
That's granular.
Yeah.
It sounds like OSHA inspectors are trained to be meticulous detectives.
They are. And they're looking at the big picture, too. They want to understand your overall safety and health management system.
So it's not just about fixing that one unguarded saw. It's about demonstrating that you have a system in place to prevent those kinds of hazards from happening in the first place.
Exactly. They'll look at your training records, your safety committees, how you investigate incidents, everything.
So it's about proving that safety is baked into your company's DNA.
Yes.
Not just an afterthought.
You got it. And here's where it gets really interesting for you as safety pros. The manual actually outlines some of the most common affirmative defenses that employers might use.
Okay, so I'm all ears. Give us the lowdown on these defenses. What are employers throwing out there?
One common one is unpreventable employee misconduct. Basically, they're saying, hey, we did everything right, but our employee went rogue.
So how do you counter that argument? It sounds like a he said, she said situation.
You need to be ready to demonstrate that you had a clear work rule in place, that it was communicated effectively, that you had methods for discovering violations. And here's the kicker, that you enforced those rules consistently.
So it's not enough to just have a rule on paper. You need to show that you're actively enforcing it, that there are consequences for breaking the rules.
Precisely. Documentation is key here. Think disciplinary records, incident reports, even training records that show employees were aware of the rules.
Okay, so unpreventable employee misconduct is one defense. What else does the manual cover?
Another one you might encounter is impossibility of compliance. That's where the employer claims that following the OSHA standard would make it literally impossible to do the work.
So they're basically saying we can't comply with the rule without shutting down our entire operation.
Exactly. But as a safety pro, you need to be ready to push back on that. You need to show that compliance might be difficult but not impossible, or that the employer hasn't explored all possible alternatives.
So you need to do your research, understand the industry, and come armed with potential solutions or examples of other companies that have successfully implemented the standard.
You got it. And there's one more defense I want to touch on, the greater hazard defense.
Okay, this one sounds intriguing. Break it down for us.
In this case, the employer is arguing that complying with the OSHA standard would actually create a greater hazard than not complying.
Whoa, that's a bold claim. So how do you even begin to address that?
You need to be prepared to present evidence that the employer hasn't taken all reasonable steps to mitigate the hazard or explore alternative solutions. It's about showing that they haven't exhausted all their options before resorting to the greater hazard argument.
It sounds like having a deep understanding of this manual can really help level the playing field between employers and OSHA.
Absolutely. And remember, the manual is constantly being updated, so it's crucial to stay current with the latest version.
That's a great point. We'll be sure to include a link to the most recent manual in the show notes for our listeners. Now, speaking of documentation, the manual also dives into the importance of employee interviews, right?
That's right. Those interview statements can be powerful evidence, especially when there's a potential controversy or conflicting accounts of an incident.
So how should safety professionals approach these interviews? Are there any tips or tricks from the manual?
The manual offers some great guidance on conducting effective employee interviews. First off, whenever possible, try to get written statements.
Okay,
This creates a more formal record of the interview.
that makes sense. It's harder to dispute a written statement than a verbal recollection. What else should we keep in mind?
Encourage employees to use their own words and write in the first person. This helps ensure that the statement is authentic and reflects their actual experience.
Good point.
Yep.
It shouldn't sound like we're putting words in their mouth. We want their genuine account of what happened, anything else.
Absolutely. It's crucial to ensure that employees fully understand the statement and have a chance to make corrections before they sign it. And the manual also highlights the importance of respecting confidentiality. Employees have the right to request that their statement be kept confidential.
That's so important. We want employees to feel comfortable sharing information without fear of retaliation.
Exactly. And depending on the situation, it might be appropriate to record the interview either with audio or video.
That makes sense. But of course, that would only be with the employee's consent, right?
Absolutely. Consent is key. And even if you do record the interview, it's still a good practice to have a written transcript as well, especially for serious cases.
It's like having multiple layers of documentation, each one reinforcing the other.
Precisely. It creates a more permanent and easily accessible record of the interview.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about documentation, but let's shift gears a bit and talk about citations. How does the manual guide OSHA inspectors when it comes to issuing those dreaded citations?
Well, first and foremost, the manual emphasizes that citations need to be clear, concise, and specific. They can't be vague or ambiguous.
So no more, this place looks unsafe, fix it.
Exactly. The citation must clearly state the nature of the violation, reference the specific OSHA standard that's been violated, and set a reasonable deadline for abatement.
Abatement, you mean actually fixing the hazard?
That's right. And those deadlines can't be open-ended or arbitrary. They have to be based on the nature of the hazard and the feasibility of correcting it within a certain time frame.
So a minor violation like a missing fire extinguisher sign
Yeah,
might have a shorter deadline than a complex engineering control.
exactly. And the manual also covers the statute of limitations for issuing citations. Generally, OSHA has 6 months from the date of the violation to issue a citation.
So if they discover a violation that happened 7 months ago, they're out of luck.
Generally, yes, but there are exceptions, such as if the employer concealed the violation or if it's a continuing violation.
It sounds like there's a lot of legal nuance to this process.
There is, and the manual provides a lot of guidance on how to navigate those nuances. It also outlines the procedures for amending or withdrawing citations if errors are found.
So it's not like a one-and-done deal.
Yeah.
There's room for adjustments and corrections if needed.
Right. Now, when it comes to delivering citations, the manual has specific guidelines for that as well.
Okay, let's hear it. How does OSHA make sure those citations get into the right hands?
Typically, citations are sent by certified mail. This provides proof of delivery and creates a paper trail. But the manual also allows for other methods like hand delivery or courier services, as long as there's proof of receipt.
So it's all about making sure the employer is properly notified and has no excuse for claiming they were unaware of the citation.
Exactly. And speaking of documentation, the manual is very clear about the need to maintain accurate and complete inspection records.
So we're talking about those detailed notes, photos, employee interview statements, everything we've been discussing, right?
Precisely. Those records aren't just for the inspector's personal use, they're considered the property of the government.
So no taking those files home as souvenirs.
Definitely not. And here's another crucial point. The manual emphasizes the confidentiality of information obtained during inspections.
That makes sense. We need to protect sensitive information, especially when it involves things like trade secrets or employee medical records.
Absolutely. And the manual has an entire section dedicated to handling trade secret information, outlining strict procedures to ensure confidentiality.
So if an employer claims something is a trade secret, how does OSHA handle that?
The manual instructs inspectors to treat the information as a trade secret unless they have compelling evidence to the contrary. They have to label any related documents as administratively controlled information and restrict access to those materials.
So it's a balancing act between conducting a thorough inspection and protecting sensitive business information. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about something that's becoming increasingly common in OSHA inspections, the use of video and audio recordings.
You know, that's one of the areas where technology has really changed the game. The manual now actively encourages the use of video recording to document violations.
Really? So those scenes we see on TV of OSHA inspectors filming unsafe conditions, those are accurate.
They can be. In fact, the manual specifically states that certain types of inspections, like fatality investigations or imminent danger situations, should always include video recording.
That makes sense. It creates a more objective and unbiased record of the scene, especially when emotions are running high.
Exactly. And it can be particularly helpful when documenting complex or hard-to-describe hazards.
Like a piece of machinery with multiple moving parts, or a hazardous process that's difficult to capture in words or even photographs.
Precisely. A video can often capture those details far more effectively than any other method.
So it's about using technology to enhance the accuracy and completeness of the documentation.
Exactly. But remember, technology doesn't replace the need for other forms of documentation, like notes, photos, and sketches. It's about using all the tools at your disposal to create a comprehensive record of the inspection.
And ultimately a safer workplace.
Absolutely. And here's another interesting tidbit from the manual. It encourages inspectors to maintain a detailed activity diary sheet for each case.
A diary sheet. Now that sounds a bit personal.
It's not a personal diary in the traditional sense. Think of it more like a chronological log of all the activities related to the case, from the initial complaint to the final resolution.
So it's like a timeline of the entire inspection process, ensuring that nothing falls through the cracks.
Exactly. And it can be a valuable tool for reconstructing the chain of events, which can be crucial in legal proceedings.
It sounds like the OSHA Field Operations Manual is incredibly thorough, covering every detail from the big picture down to the nitty-gritty.
It is, and while it's written primarily for OSHA inspectors, it's an invaluable resource for anyone involved in workplace safety and health.
It's like having a secret decoder ring to understand how OSHA operates.
I like that analogy, and the best part is it's publicly available on OSHA's website.
So there's no excuse not to read it. We'll be sure to include a link in the show notes.
Perfect. Because knowledge is power, especially when it comes to safety.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but there's still more to explore in the OSHA Field Operations Manual. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve into even more juicy details and practical insights.
Until then, stay safe, stay informed, and keep diving deep. Welcome back to The Deep Dive, brought to you by Safety One Source. We're continuing our exploration of the OSHA Field Operations Manual, that treasure trove of insights for safety pros.
You know, it is amazing how much practical information is packed in this manual. It's like they anticipated every question a safety pro might have and laid out a clear path for us to follow.
That's a great point. And speaking of practical information, last time we touched on the importance of documenting hazards effectively. The manual provides a ton of guidance on this.
I'm all ears. Give us the rundown. What are the key things we need to nail down when documenting hazards?
Well, first off, clarity is key. You need to clearly identify the hazard, explain why it's a violation, and cite the specific OSHA standard that's being broken.
Okay, so no more vague statements like, this area seems kind of risky.
Definitely not. You need to be specific and demonstrate that you know your stuff. that you're not just making arbitrary judgments.
Like presenting a case in court.
Exactly.
You need the evidence to back up your claims.
Exactly. And the manual goes even further. It emphasizes the importance of describing the hazard in detail, including its location size and any other relevant characteristics.
So, for example, if we're dealing with a chemical spill, we need to note the specific substance, the quantity, and the area it covers.
You got it. And don't forget to document the potential consequences of exposure to the hazard. What could actually happen if someone is exposed?
Right, so instead of just saying possible injury, we need to be more specific, like risk of chemical burns or potential for respiratory problems.
Precisely. It's about connecting the dots between the hazard and the potential harm. And remember, measurements are your friend. If you're dealing with noise, air quality, or other measurable hazards, make sure you're taking accurate readings and documenting those results.
Of course, we got to use calibrated equipment and follow proper procedures. We don't want our measurements thrown out because we cut corners.
Excellent point. The manual is all about accuracy and precision in documentation. It's about building a rock-solid case that can withstand scrutiny.
Speaking of building a case, the manual really dives deep on the topic of employer knowledge. It seems like establishing that the employer knew about the hazard is a critical part of proving a violation.
You're absolutely right. It's often a linchpin in a successful case.
Yeah.
But proving that an employer knew about a hazard can be tricky. They're not exactly going to admit it readily.
So how do we go about gathering that evidence? Do we need to become safety detectives?
Well, a little bit of detective work never hurts. The manual encourages inspectors and, by extension, safety professionals like you to gather evidence from various sources. That includes employee interviews, company records, and even the physical evidence at the worksite.
So it's like piecing together a puzzle. We need to look for clues in all sorts of places.
Exactly, and the manual provides some great examples of what kind of evidence can be used. For example, previous citations for the same or similar hazards can be pretty damning. It suggests a pattern of negligence or indifference.
So if a company has been cited multiple times for unguarded machinery, it's hard to argue that they were unaware of the hazard.
Right. Internal incident reports can also be really valuable. If an employee reported a hazard but no action was taken, it suggests that the employer knew about the problem but chose to ignore it.
It's about demonstrating a disregard for safety concerns and a failure to take action. And what about those smoking gun emails or memos?
You got it written. Communication can be gold. If there's evidence that management knew about a hazard but didn't do anything, that can be powerful proof of knowledge.
It's all about connecting the dots and building that undeniable case. The manual even provides specific examples of evidence that can be used to establish employer knowledge.
That's right. For instance, let's say employees have been complaining about excessive noise levels for months, but the employer has done nothing to address it. That's a pretty clear indication that they knew about the hazard.
And if we have those training records showing that employees were trained on noise hazards but weren't given proper hearing protection, it just strengthens the case.
Exactly. It paints a picture of an employer who knew about the risk, understood the consequences, and still failed to protect their workers.
This goes way beyond simple negligence.
Yeah.
It suggests a conscious disregard for employee safety.
Absolutely. And that's where the different classifications of violations come into play.
You mean things like serious violations, willful violations, repeat violations, that kind of thing.
Exactly. The manual lays out clear definitions for each type of violation and provides the criteria for classifying them.
So let's break it down. A serious violation is where there's a substantial probability of death or serious injury. A willful violation involves intentional disregard for the law. And a repeat violation happens when an employer has been previously cited for the same hazard.
You nailed it. The severity of the violation and the employer's history of compliance. These are key factors in determining how a violation is classified.
And of course, the classification impacts the penalties that can be handed down. A willful violation is going to carry a much heavier penalty than a serious violation.
You're absolutely right. And the manual actually provides guidance on how those penalties are calculated. It takes into account things like the severity of the violation, the size of the employer, and their history of compliance.
I bet there's a complex formula involved there.
There is, but the manual breaks it down step by step. And here's something interesting. It also discusses the possibility of penalty reductions for employers who demonstrate good faith efforts to comply with OSHA standards.
Even if a company messed up, they can still lessen the blow by showing they're actively trying to improve their safety program.
Exactly. And the manual actually gives examples of what those good faith efforts might look like. Things like promptly correcting hazards, implementing safety training programs, and cooperating with OSHA inspectors.
It's encouraging to see that OSHA recognizes and rewards proactive efforts. It shows that they're not just about punishment. They want to see companies improve their safety culture.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another important topic covered in the manual, the section on abatement.
Abatement. Okay, remind me, what's that all about?
Abatement basically means fixing the problem, correcting the hazards that were identified during the inspection.
Got it. So it's not enough to just point out the hazards. We have to make sure they actually get fixed.
Right. And the manual lays out specific guidelines for establishing abatement deadlines. These are the dates by which the employer must correct the violations.
So we're talking about setting clear and achievable deadlines, taking into account the complexity of the fix.
Exactly. A simple fix, like replacing a guardrail, might have a much shorter deadline than something that requires a major engineering overhaul.
Makes sense. We need to balance urgency with practicality.
You got it. And the manual acknowledges that sometimes unexpected things happen. It allows for the possibility of extending abatement deadlines if unforeseen circumstances arise.
So let's say a company orders a critical part for a machine, but there's a supply chain delay. They could potentially request an extension.
Precisely, but it's not a free pass. The employer needs to provide documentation to support their request and prove that they're doing everything they can to expedite the abatement.
It's all about accountability and transparency.
Absolutely. And the manual stresses that abatement verification is a crucial part of the process.
So we're not just taking their word for it. OSHA's going to follow up and make sure those hazards have actually been corrected.
That's right. Inspectors have several ways to verify abatement. They can conduct follow-up inspections, review documentation provided by the employer, or even conduct phone interviews with employees.
It's good to know that OSHA is closing the loop and ensuring that workplaces are truly becoming safer.
Exactly, and if an employer fails to abate a hazard by the deadline, they can face additional penalties, even legal action.
So the stakes are high. This manual really drives home the point that OSHA regulations are serious business and worker safety is paramount.
You're absolutely right. And the manual provides a valuable roadmap for both employers and safety professionals. It helps us navigate the complex world of OSHA compliance.
It's incredible how much we've learned from just one chapter of this manual. There's so much practical information that safety professionals can use to elevate their programs. It's like having a cheat sheet for success.
And we're not done yet. There's still more ground to cover. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll wrap up our exploration and discuss some key takeaways and action steps.
Sounds good to me. Until then, stay safe, stay informed, and keep diving deep. Welcome back to the Deep Dives, brought to you by Safety One Source. We're wrapping up our 3-part series on the OSHA Field Operations Manual, specifically Chapter 5, which is all about case file preparation and documentation.
It has been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've covered so much, from identifying hazards and gathering evidence.
Yeah. To interviewing employees and understanding those tricky employer defenses.
We even explored the legal side of things.
Yeah.
Like issuing citations, calculating penalties, and ensuring abatement. It's like we've earned an honorary OSHA inspector badge.
I wouldn't go that far,
Yeah.
but I do think our listeners are getting a real sense of how valuable this manual can be. It's not just about avoiding fines. It's about building a safety program that truly protects workers. You know, what's really struck me throughout this deep dive is how much emphasis the manual places on proactive safety management. It's not just about reacting to hazards after they occur. It's about having systems in place to prevent those hazards from happening in the first place.
You're spot on, and there's actually a whole section in the manual devoted to safety and health management systems.
Right.
It's like OSHA is saying, hey, we don't want to just catch you doing things wrong. We want to see you building a culture of safety from the ground up.
Okay, now that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Give us the highlights. What does the manual say about creating a top-notch safety management system?
Well, it all starts with leadership. Management needs to be fully committed to safety, not just paying lip service, but truly making it a core value.
It's about walking the talk,
Yeah,
leading by example and making sure safety is woven into the fabric of the company.
exactly. And it can't just be a top-down approach. Worker participation is absolutely crucial. You need to involve employees in identifying hazards, developing solutions, and implementing safety procedures.
That makes a ton of sense. After all, they're the ones on the front lines. They see the hazards firsthand and often have the best ideas for how to address them.
Right. And of course, you need a systematic way to identify and assess hazards in the workplace. Think regular inspections, analyzing job tasks, reviewing incident reports, that kind of thing.
So it's about being proactive and seeking out those potential hazards rather than waiting for them to bite us.
You got it. And once you've identified those hazards, you need a solid process for controlling them. That means implementing engineering controls, establishing safe work practices, and providing appropriate personal protective equipment.
So it's like a multi-layered approach, using a combination of strategies to minimize the risk.
Exactly. And let's not forget about education and training. Employees need to understand the hazards they face and know how to work safely.
Training is so crucial. It empowers employees to take ownership of their own safety and make smart decisions in the field.
Couldn't agree more. And finally, the manual emphasizes the importance of having a system for evaluating and improving your safety program.
So it's not a one-time thing.
No.
We need to be constantly assessing our program, analyzing incident data, and making adjustments as needed.
Exactly. It's about continuous improvement, always striving to make the workplace safer.
It's like what they say in the business world, what gets measured gets managed.
That's a great analogy. And the manual actually encourages OSHA inspectors to evaluate the effectiveness of a company's safety management system, not just its existence on paper.
So it's not enough to just have a safety manual gathering dust on a shelf. It needs to be a living document that's actually being used and implemented effectively.
Precisely. And if an inspector finds that a company's safety management system is lacking, that can influence the severity of any violations and the penalties they face.
Wow, so having a strong safety management system can actually help reduce penalties even if there are violations.
That's right. It demonstrates a commitment to safety and shows that the company is taking proactive steps to protect its workers.
It's like getting extra credit for good behavior.
Yeah.
So what kind of questions should companies be asking themselves to make sure their safety management system is up to snuff?
Well, the manual offers some great examples they might ask. How does management demonstrate its commitment to safety? Or how are workers involved in hazard identification and control?
Those are great questions. They really get to the heart of whether safety is truly integrated into the company's culture or just an afterthought.
Exactly. And remember, it's not just about checking boxes and complying with the bare minimum. It's about creating a workplace where everyone feels safe and empowered to speak up about hazards.
So it's about going beyond the letter of the law and embracing the spirit of safety.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, folks, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the OSHA Field Operations Manual. It's been an incredible journey, and I hope you've gained some valuable insights that you can apply to your own safety programs.
I second that. Remember, the manual is a publicly available resource. So be sure to check it out and use it as a guide to building a safer, healthier, and more resilient workplace.
And as always, stay safe, stay informed, and keep diving deep.